Sarah Washington's morning began unraveling at 5:47 a.m. when her phone lit up with a message from Cedar Grove Nursing Home. Her mother had fallen during her morning walk, and while nothing was broken, the incident demanded immediate attention. Sarah spent 2 hours coordinating with medical staff and her mother's care team, all while preparing for a crucial hearing in Judge Bennett's courtroom. The universe, it seemed, had other plans for her meticulously scheduled day. Boston's typically congested morning traffic transformed into complete gridlock when a delivery truck overturned on Atlantic Avenue, spilling its cargo across 3 lanes. Sarah watched precious minutes tick by on her car's dashboard clock, her heart racing faster than her stalled vehicle could move. Inside her briefcase lay 3 weeks of preparation for the Thompson housing discrimination case, a pro bono matter she'd taken on behalf of 3 elderly residents facing wrongful eviction. The irony of being late to defend people who might lose their homes on her. Sarah had built her reputation on punctuality and preparation, earning respect from colleagues one case at a time over 15 years of practice. At 8:57 a.m., Sarah's heels clicked rapidly against the courthouse's marble floors, the sound echoing through the nearly empty corridors. Most attorneys and clients had already filed into their respective courtrooms. Her normally immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of the morning's chaos. A slight crease in her charcoal gray suit. One pearl earring missing, left behind somewhere between her car and the security checkpoint. Judge Michael Bennett's courtroom 4B had earned a reputation as the most formally run courtroom in the Boston municipal court system. Attorneys spoke in whispers about his zero-tolerance policy for tardiness, his demand for perfect procedural compliance, and his particular disdain for what he termed modern casual attitudes toward judicial respect. At precisely 9 o'clock a.m., his bailiff would lock the courtroom doors, and anyone arriving afterward faced consequences that became cautionary tales at bar association lunches. Sarah reached the heavy wooden doors at 9:03 a.m., her breath coming in controlled measures. Through the door's narrow window, she could see Judge Bennett already seated at his bench, his silver hair and black robes cutting an imposing figure against the wood-paneled wall. His eyes flicked toward the clock above the entrance, then to the door where Sarah stood, his expression hardening into familiar lines of disapproval. The bailiff, Tom Martinez, who had known Sarah for years through various cases, gave her an apologetic look as he unlocked the door. The creak of old hinges announced her entrance to the packed courtroom, where 30 heads turned simultaneously to witness the disruption. Her clients, the 3 Thompson case defendants, sat in the front row, their worried expressions deepening at their attorney's unusual late arrival. Judge Bennett's fingers drummed a slow, deliberate rhythm on his bench. The sound carried through the now silent courtroom like thunder before a storm. Sarah moved toward the defense table with practiced dignity, her case files clutched close, her mind already formulating the explanation she knew she'd need to provide. The morning light streaming through tall windows cast stark shadows across the judge's face, highlighting the deep frown lines that seemed permanently etched around his mouth. What happened next would become a turning point in the Boston legal community's ongoing conversation about bias, power, and the face of modern justice, though none of the participants knew it yet. They were about to step into a moment that would challenge long-held assumptions and force uncomfortable but necessary growth in ways that would ripple through courtrooms across the state. Ms. Washington. Judge Bennett's voice sliced through the courtroom's tense silence. He drew out each syllable of her name like a prosecutor laying out evidence. Perhaps you operate on a different time zone than the rest of us. Sarah straightened her spine, maintaining the composure that had carried her through countless difficult moments in her career. Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for my tardiness. There was an emergency with my elderly mother this morning, followed by a major traffic accident on Atlantic. Spare us the creative excuses, counselor. Judge Bennett's interruption echoed off the high ceiling. This court's time is valuable, and your lack of proper planning does not constitute an emergency on our part. His words carried the weight of decades of unchallenged authority. The Thompson family, Sarah's clients, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Thompson, the eldest at 78, clutched her handkerchief tighter, her weathered face reflecting the anxiety of someone who had seen too many authority figures abuse their power. Your Honor, if I may. Sarah attempted again, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. You may not. Judge Bennett leaned forward, his reading glasses catching the morning light. In fact, Ms. Washington, I find your casual attitude toward this court's schedule particularly troubling. It speaks to a broader decay in professional standards that I refuse to tolerate in my courtroom. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances. Mark Rodriguez, a veteran public defender, shook his head slightly. He'd seen Judge Bennett be stern before, but this felt different, more personal, more pointed. The court imposes a $500 penalty for contempt. Judge Bennett continued, his gavel punctuating each word. Perhaps that will serve as a reminder that punctuality is not merely a suggestion in this courtroom. Sarah absorbed the blow with dignity, though her fingers pressed white marks into her leather portfolio. The amount wasn't devastating to her financially, but the public dressing down stung in ways that had nothing to do with money. A young law clerk in the back row dropped her pen, the plastic clatter breaking the tension momentarily. Judge Bennett's eyes snapped in that direction, causing the clerk to shrink in her seat. When his gaze returned to Sarah, there was something almost satisfied in his expression, the look of someone who believed they were maintaining necessary standards against modern erosion. Now, Ms. Washington, shall we proceed with your case? That is, if you're adequately prepared, given your obviously rushed arrival. The sarcasm in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah's response was measured, professional, and precisely pitched. Yes, Your Honor. The defense is fully prepared to proceed with the Thompson matter. She pulled out her meticulously organized files, each document tagged and highlighted with her characteristic thoroughness. The gallery watched with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort as Sarah launched into her opening arguments, her voice never wavering. She cited precedents with machine-gun precision, her arguments flowing with the clarity and force that had won her dozens of difficult cases. It was a masterclass in professional composure under fire. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Sarah's mind was already calculating. In 15 years of practice, she faced countless microaggressions and subtle dismissals. This incident was different, more overt, more public, and somehow more personal. As she presented her client's case, a part of her was already thinking about the broader implications of this morning's interaction and about changes that needed to happen in the system she dedicated her life to serving. Judge Bennett would soon discover just how consequential his actions this morning would prove to be, though for now, he simply sat in his elevated position, unaware that his world was about to shift dramatically. Judge Bennett strode through the mahogany doors of the Massachusetts Bar Association's executive conference room at precisely 1:30 p.m., his confidence buoyed by years of being the most important person in any room he entered. The afternoon light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the prestigious space where legal policies were shaped and careers were made. He adjusted his silk tie, a gift from his daughter emblazoned with tiny scales of justice, and mentally rehearsed his planned remarks about maintaining professional standards in the modern legal environment. The morning's courtroom incident still fresh in his mind, he thought it would make an excellent example of the declining respect for judicial authority. The conversation in the room died as he entered, but not in the way he was accustomed to. Instead of the usual deferential silence, there was a peculiar tension in the air. Richard Chen, a longtime colleague, gave him an unreadable look that bordered on discomfort. At the head of the expansive conference table, a familiar figure stood reviewing documents with two senior board members. Judge Bennett's steps faltered. Sarah Washington commanded the room with an authority that seemed to dwarf his own presence. Her suit was still impeccable despite the morning's events, her bearing regal as she gestured to something in the papers before her. The golden nameplate in front of her position read Sarah Washington, President, Massachusetts Bar Association. Ah, Judge Bennett, called out Margaret Whitman, the association's senior vice president. I don't believe you had the chance to formally meet our new president. Sarah was unanimously elected last month, the youngest president in our history, and her initiatives for legal aid reform have already gained national attention. The room seemed to shrink around him. Sarah turned, her expression perfectly professional, betraying none of the morning's tension. Judge Bennett, she said, her voice carrying the weight of her position. I trust your morning session concluded productively. Several board members shifted in their seats, and Judge Bennett realized with growing horror that the morning's incident had already made its rounds through the legal community's efficient grapevine. His collar suddenly felt too tight. Ms. Washington, he managed, years of judicial composure barely keeping his voice steady. I wasn't aware of your position with the association. Few are, at first glance, she replied, the subtle emphasis on her last words hanging in the air between them. Please have a seat. We were just discussing the association's new initiative on judicial ethics and implicit bias in the courtroom. Your input would be particularly valuable today. Judge Bennett sank into the nearest chair, hyper-aware of the eyes on him. The agenda before him swung into focus. Modernizing judicial conduct. Addressing systemic bias in our courts. His own morning behavior now played back in his mind like damning evidence in a trial. Sarah smoothly transitioned into her presentation, commanding the room's attention with a grace that made his earlier treatment of her seem even more egregious. She outlined comprehensive plans for reform, cited statistics about discriminatory patterns in judicial conduct, and presented solutions with the expertise of someone who had navigated these challenges personally. As she spoke, Judge Bennett noticed details he overlooked in his courtroom: her Harvard law ring, the subtle pride in her bearing that he'd mistaken for arrogance, and most importantly, the respect she commanded from every person in the room. Respect earned through excellence rather than assumed through position. The revelation wasn't just about her title, it was about his own glaring blind spots. As Sarah eloquently discussed the need for change in the system, Judge Bennett realized he had become the perfect example of why that change was necessary. The grandfather clock in Judge Bennett's study struck 9, each chime echoing through the empty house like a gavel falling on his conscience. He sat in his leather chair, his usually pristine desk now cluttered with printouts of Sarah Washington's accomplishments, articles that painted a portrait of excellence peeping too blind to see. A half-empty glass of Macallan 18 sat untouched by his mousepad, the amber liquid catching the dim light from his desk lamp. His computer screen glowed with yet another article. Sarah Washington makes history. Youngest president of Massachusetts Bar Association charts bold new course for legal reform. He clicked through her career history with growing discomfort. Harvard Law Review editor, Supreme Court clerkship, multiple landmark civil rights victories, pro bono work that had changed state legislation. Each achievement felt like another indictment of his morning behavior. How did I not know? He whispered to his reflection in the darkened window, but the real question burning in his mind was, would it have mattered if I had known? His phone buzzed. A message from his daughter, Catherine, herself a junior attorney in California. Dad saw what happened in Boston today. Call me. The legal community's grapevine had reached the West Coast. He couldn't bring himself to respond. Judge Bennett rose from his desk, pacing the room as memories from his 20-year career played through his mind like evidence in a trial. How many other Sarah Washingtons had stood before him? How many times had his maintenance of standards been something else entirely? He paused at the wall of photographs chronicling his legal career, his judicial inauguration, handshakes with governors and senators, speaking engagements at prestigious universities. In each image, he saw what he'd always seen: achievement, authority, respect. But now, for the first time, he noticed something else. The homogeneity of the faces surrounding him, the comfortable insularity of his world. Returning to his computer, he opened his case records from the past year. Patterns emerged that he'd never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. His maintaining of standards had not been as evenly applied as he believed. The evidence was there in his own records, damning in its clarity. The clock struck 10 as he began writing in his judicial notebook, his pen moving with unusual urgency. Today, I saw my own prejudice reflected in the faces of my colleagues. The shame isn't in the revelation. It's in how long it took to arrive. Sarah Washington didn't just expose my bias. She exposed the comfort with which I've wielded authority without wisdom. He thought about tomorrow's docket. 3 cases involving minority defendants. 2 female attorneys scheduled to appear. Everything looked different now, filtered through the harsh light of self-awareness. A framed quote on his wall. Words from Thurgood Marshall seemed to mock him. In recognizing the humanity of our fellow beings, we pay ourselves the highest tribute. How many times had he read those words without truly understanding their weight? Near midnight, Judge Bennett finally closed his laptop. The articles, the records, the statistics, they all pointed to an uncomfortable truth. His courtroom, his supposed bastion of justice, had been tainted by the very biases he'd sworn to stand against. Tomorrow would require something he'd rarely done from the bench: acknowledge a fundamental error in a judgment. The thought made him uncomfortable, but discomfort he was beginning to understand was perhaps the price of growth. As he prepared to leave his study, he picked up the untouched scotch and poured it down the sink. Tonight called for clarity, not comfort. Tomorrow would require all the courage and humility he could muster. Judge Bennett's black Mercedes idled outside the Washington Community Law Center at 7:15 a.m., 30 minutes before his usual arrival time at the courthouse. The modest 3-story building stood in stark contrast to the gleaming downtown towers where he typically conducted business. A steady stream of young lawyers and law students filed through its doors, carrying coffee cups and worn briefcases. Through the large ground floor windows, he could see Sarah Washington conducting what appeared to be a morning briefing. She stood at a whiteboard, her gesture animated as she explained something to a diverse group of young attorneys. Their faces showed intense concentration, notebooks open, hanging on her every word. A young man in a slightly oversized suit raised his hand, asking a question. Instead of giving an immediate answer, Stara smiled and turned the question back to the group, fostering a discussion that had everyone engaged. It was masterful teaching, the kind that built not just knowledge, but confidence. Everything all right, sir? A security guard's voice startled Bennett from his observations. Officer James Robinson, according to his nameplate, stood beside the car, his expression professional but watchful. Aye, yes, Bennett replied, suddenly aware of how suspicious he must look. I was actually hoping to speak with Ms. Washington. President Washington is conducting her morning mentorship session, Officer Robinson replied, emphasizing her title slightly. She doesn't accept unscheduled visitors during this time. It's reserved for the fellowship program participants. Fellowship program. Bennett recalled reading about it the night before. An initiative Sarah had started to provide intensive training for lawyers from underserved communities. Many of its graduates had gone on to prestigious positions, changing the face of Boston's legal establishment one success story at a time. Inside, Sarah was now sitting with a young woman who appeared to be on the verge of tears. The interaction was too distant to hear, but the body language told its own story. Sarah's posture was entirely focused on the young woman, offering what appeared to be both compassion and strength. Minutes later, the young lawyer straightened her shoulders, wiped her eyes, and nodded with new determination. She does that a lot, Officer Robinson commented, following Bennett's gaze. Builds them back up when the system tears them down. Been working here 3 years, seeing hundreds of lawyers come through those doors barely holding on. They leave standing tall. Bennett watched as Sarah checked her watch and began gathering her things. Despite the early hour and the emotional mentoring session, she showed the same commanding presence she demonstrated in his courtroom. Like here, that presence wasn't a challenge to authority. It was a lifeline to those who needed it. What time do these sessions start? Bennett asked quietly. 6 a.m. sharp. Every morning, rain or shine. President Washington hasn't missed one in 5 years, except when she's arguing cases out of state. The pride in Officer Robinson's voice was evident. Changes lives in that room, one lawyer at a time. 6 a.m. She'd been here since 6, mentoring the next generation. Then faced his courtroom's humiliation, then commanded the Bar Association meeting, and probably returned here afterward. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Sarah emerged from the building, briefcase in hand. For a moment, their eyes met through the car window. She showed no surprise at his presence, merely nodding slightly before heading toward her own car. Bennett watched her drive away, then pulled out his phone and called his clerk. Cancel my morning schedule, he instructed. There's something I need to write. An apology that can't wait. The security guard was still watching him. Bennett felt the unfamiliar sensation of being an outsider in a world he thought he knew. It was uncomfortable, but maybe he realized that discomfort was exactly what he needed to feel. Courtroom 4B buzzed with unusual energy at 8:55 a.m. Word had spread that Judge Bennett had cleared his morning docket except for a single announcement. Sarah Washington sat in the gallery's front row, her presence drawing curious glances from the assembled lawyers and court staff. The bailiff's all rise carried more weight than usual. Judge Bennett emerged from his chambers without his usual robes, wearing instead a charcoal gray suit. The symbolic departure from tradition sent a ripple through the courtroom. He remained standing rather than taking his seat, his hands resting lightly on the bench. Please be seated, he began, his voice lacking its usual authoritative boom. What I have to say this morning requires me to step down from this elevated position, both literally and figuratively. He stepped around to the front of the bench, an unprecedented move that caused several veteran attorneys to exchange startled looks. The marble floor echoed under his dress shoes as he moved to stand before Sarah. Yesterday morning, I abused my position of authority to humiliate an attorney in this courtroom. I did so without proper cause, without proper consideration, and most damningly without proper humanity. His voice carried clearly through the silent room. Ms. Washington, I was wrong. Sarah maintained perfect composure, her expression neutral but attentive. Around her, phones had disappeared into pockets. This moment demanded presence, not documentation. My actions reflected biases that I had convinced myself I didn't possess. Biases that have no place in this courtroom or any courtroom. Biases that directly contradict the oath I took to uphold equal justice under law. Bennett's voice cracked slightly on the word justice. He turned to address the entire courtroom. I have spent 20 years on this bench believing I was maintaining standards. Yesterday forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes what we call maintaining standards is actually perpetuating barriers. barriers that have kept too many brilliant minds from taking their rightful place in our profession. Sarah's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly, the only visible reaction to his words. The $500 penalty is, of course, rescinded. But that's not enough. Money can't address the real damage done when those in power abuse their authority. He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a folded paper. This morning, I filed a formal letter with the Judicial Conduct Committee, documenting my actions and requesting that they be added to my permanent record. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judges rarely self-reported their conduct violations. Ms. Washington, he turned back to Sarah, your reputation for excellence was well established long before you entered my courtroom. Your leadership of the Bar Association is not what makes my conduct reprehensible. My conduct was reprehensible because it violated the basic dignity every person deserves, regardless of their titles or achievements. Sarah finally spoke, her voice measured. Thank you, Your Honor. May I address the court? Bennett nodded, and she rose. Your words this morning demonstrate why our legal system, despite its flaws, carries the capacity for growth. This acknowledgement is appreciated not just for me, but for every attorney who has faced similar treatment without the position or platform to challenge it. The clock struck 9 o'clock a.m., its chime breaking the moment's gravity. Bennett returned behind his bench but remained standing. Court is adjourned for the morning, he announced. Except, Ms. Washington, might I request a few minutes of your time? I believe we have some important matters to discuss regarding the future of this court. As the gallery began to clear, the morning sun broke through the courtroom's high windows, casting long shadows behind everyone present. Shadows that seemed just a bit shorter than they had been the day before. The judge's private conference room felt different without the trappings of judicial authority. Judge Bennett had deliberately chosen this neutral space over his chambers, and as he sat across from Sarah Washington, the mahogany table between them seemed to represent decades of institutional barriers being dismantled one conversation at a time. First, I'd like to hear about your morning mentorship program, Bennett began, surprising Sarah with his knowledge. Officer Robinson spoke highly of it. A slight smile crossed Sarah's face. So you were the mysterious Mercedes outside our building. I thought I recognized it. She paused, studying him. What made you come? I needed to see the real Sarah Washington, not the one I prejudged in my courtroom. Bennett's fingers traced the wood grain of the table. I watched you rebuild a young lawyer's confidence this morning, something I probably destroyed in others over the years. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. Judge Bennett, let me tell you about Lauren Torres. She was in that session this morning, the one you saw prying. She waited for his nod of recognition. 3 months ago, a judge very much like yourself dismissed her arguments and mocked her pronunciation of legal terms. She nearly quit law entirely. Bennett felt the weight of similar moments from his own court sessions. And now? Now she's preparing to argue a housing discrimination case next week. The same kind of case I was handling in your courtroom. Sarah's voice carried no accusation, just simple truth. This is what systematic barriers look like in real time. Death by 1,000 cuts to confidence, to ambition, to the belief that justice is truly blind. The clock ticked softly as Bennett absorbed her words. How do you maintain your composure, your dignity? Even yesterday when I was, he trailed off. Being deliberately demean? Sarah finished. She smiled without humor. Black women learn early that we'll be judged twice as harshly for showing a fraction of the emotion others display freely. My mother taught me that composure isn't just about dignity, it's armor. Bennett removed his reading glasses, rubbing his eyes. I've been reading about microaggressions and implicit bias, academic terms that felt disconnected until yesterday. But they're not academic at all, are they? They're Lauren Torres crying in your office. They're you standing in my courtroom, bearing the weight of assumptions I had no right to make. No, they're not academic, Sarah agreed. They're the reason I start my days at 6 a.m., helping others navigate a system that wasn't built for them. They're why every victory has to be twice as decisive, every argument twice as prepared, every appearance twice as polished. For several moments, they sat in waited silence. Then Bennett spoke again, his voice heavy with realization. I've been in law for 30 years, Ms. Washington, and I'm just now learning what it actually means to serve justice. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Then let's put that realization to work. I have a proposal for a judicial training program. Not the usual mandatory diversity seminars, but real, sustained engagement with lawyers from marginalized communities. Learning from their experiences, understanding their challenges. As they began to review the proposal, The morning light shifted, illuminating both their faces equally. Two legal minds, divided by experience but united in purpose, began the careful work of building bridges across decades of misunderstanding. "Call me Sarah," she said finally, extending her hand across the table. "I think we're past courtroom formalities." Bennett shook her hand, feeling the weight of change in the simple gesture. "Michael," he offered in return, "I have a feeling this is just the beginning of a very important partnership." The Massachusetts Bar Association's annual gala transformed the historic Boston Public Library into a glittering celebration of legal excellence. But tonight was different from previous years. The usual self-congratulatory atmosphere had been replaced by something more purposeful, more profound. At the center of it all stood Sarah Washington and Judge Michael Bennett, an unlikely pair who had become the face of institutional change. The past 6 months had transformed not just their relationship, but the landscape of Boston's legal community. The numbers speak for themselves. Sarah addressed the packed room, her voice carrying to every corner. 37 judges have completed our intensive mentorship program. Over 200 cases have been reviewed for bias analysis. 15 court procedures have been modified to ensure equal access to justice. She paused, allowing the statistics to sink in. But numbers aren't the whole story. Judge Bennett stepped forward, no longer the intimidating figure from that fateful morning. "The real change happens in moments you can't quantify," he continued. "It's in the young attorney who feels heard in my courtroom instead of fearful. It's in the client who sees themselves represented in our legal system. It's in the judges who have learned, as I did, that true justice requires constant self-examination." The audience included Lauren Torres, now a successful housing rights attorney sitting proudly with her recent court victory making headlines. In the back, Officer Robinson from the Community Law Center stood watching, having taken on an official role in the new judicial observation program. "We've made mistakes along the way," Sarah acknowledged, scanning the room. "Change isn't always comfortable. We've had resistance, skepticism, and moments of doubt. But as Dr. King reminded us, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, though sometimes it needs a little help with the bending." Laughter rippled through the room, breaking the tension. Judge Bennett smiled, remembering his own resistance to change just months ago. "Tonight, we're announcing the expansion of our program," he revealed. 5 other state bar associations have adopted our model. The Federal Circuit Court has expressed interest. What began as a personal revelation in Courtroom 4B has grown into a movement. Sarah pulled up an image on the giant screen behind them, a photo of that morning's mentorship session, now attended by both young lawyers and experienced judges, learning from each other in a space where hierarchies dissolved and real dialogue flourished. "But our proudest achievement isn't in the programs or the policies," Sarah continued. "It's in the conversations that happen daily in courthouses, law offices, and classrooms across this city. Conversations that would have been impossible 6 months ago." Judge Bennett took the podium one final time. "I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a student. Ms. Washington, Sarah, hasn't just taught me about bias in our legal system. She's shown me what real leadership looks like. Leadership that doesn't demand respect through authority, but earns it through wisdom, grace, and unwavering commitment to justice." As the gala continued into the evening, small groups formed and reformed, judges chatting with junior attorneys, public defenders sharing stories with corporate lawyers. The rigid hierarchies that had defined Boston's legal community for generations were softening, making space for new voices and perspectives. Sarah and Judge Bennett stood together near the library's grand staircase, watching their vision unfold. "You know," he said quietly, "that morning in my courtroom feels like a lifetime ago." "It was," Sarah replied, smiling. "For both of us. But some endings are just beginnings in disguise." Around them, the future of Boston's legal community continued to evolve, one conversation, one connection, one changed mind at a time. The scales of justice, ever so slightly, tipped closer to balance.